Welcome to another edition of Capital Tiger Bay. But this is going to be interesting. It's a New York bestseller. Authors Mollie Hemingway of The Federalist and Carrie Severino of the Judicial Crisis Network will be here. Bill's going to introduce them in a minute. Bill Cotterell, who's going to be moderating. And that is our capital curmudgeon, Bill Cotterell. Bill, it's all yours.
Thank you. Okay, but I've actually read the book, which I've had a couple of interviews for people I've interviewed who've said that trouble with a book tour is that you very often get interviewed by people who have no idea what you or they are talking about. So, and let me highly recommend it, those of you who've picked up a copy. It's really an entertaining as well as educational look at the Supreme Court and Washington and kind of how it works. A few minutes ago, and I felt like I already knew Mollie Hemingway. I watched her almost most Sundays on Fox's Media Buzz, Howard Kurt's program. Very knowledgeable and well-informed critic, I guess, of the political scene. She's a senior editor of The Federalist. I'm just taking it straight out of the book. I didn't research this online. But senior editor of The Federalist and contributor to Fox News, has a long list of publications she's worked for and contributed to in her career. She earned her bachelor's degree in economics at the University of Colorado and serves on the board of the News Literacy Project and the Fund for American Studies Institute on Political Journalism. The co-author, Carrie Severino, is a Harvard-educated lawyer, so right away we know she's smart. And she was chief counsel and policy director, she is, for the Judicial Crisis Network, which was one of the outside groups involved in the Kavanaugh Confirmation controversy last year. And she went to Duke as an undergraduate and was previously law clerk to Justice Clarence Thomas. So perhaps the Kavanaugh experience was not, at least the tactics used were not utterly surprising to her. And she got her master's in linguistics at Michigan State before her law degree cum laude at Harvard. So if I could invite our speakers, I'd certainly look forward to talking with them. Thank you for being with us today. Let me start with the bottom line. Do you think he did it? The accusations. Who's lying here? Christine Blasey Ford or Brett Kavanaugh?
This is kind of what the whole book is about, is looking at the entire confirmation process. And we actually didn't approach the question that way at all. What we did was we looked for evidence in support of the different claims. And it is definitely true that there is no evidence to support the allegations made by Christine Blasey Ford. There's no evidence that they actually even met, much less that this interaction that she alleged happened. She named 4 witnesses. We actually break the news in our book that the only female witness, Leland Kaiser, lifelong friend of Christine Blasey Ford's, lifelong Democrat, super liberal, did not want Brett Kavanaugh on the court, really wanted to come up with something to help her friend. And after a lot of time trying to come up with anything and reflecting on the summer in question and what their lives were like, just basically comes to lose confidence in this story, in part because people are pressuring her to change her story, and she lets the FBI know that there was pressure for her to change her story, and also that she lost confidence in her friend. At the same time, we didn't really approach it as if Christine Blasey Ford were lying. Lying implies that there is a willful intent to deceive, and it's hard to know what's inside the mind of someone. Like we said, there's no evidence in support of the allegation. We don't know exactly what was going on. We talked with memory experts who talk about the malleability of memory and how different things can affect memory. So we don't actually assert more than we can say. We just know what the facts are, and we don't know what underlied all the other issues. I want to add one more thing. Sorry. After the book came out, we learned from another book that came out that the attorney for Christine Blasey Ford did say on videotape that she and her client were politically motivated, and that was part of the reason why they came forward. It does not speak necessarily to the credibility of the underlying allegation, but just another data point that's new.
I think the other thing that was interesting to learn about is watching the way that the allegations were rolled out, which did have the hallmarks of a political campaign. So while we don't know what role she was played, was she, did she invent stories? Was her memory confused? There certainly were people who saw this as a political opportunity and were using it. And it was interesting to learn the ways in which the way that the campaign against Kavanaugh was rolled out actually undermined the case that for holding up or blocking his nomination with many of the key votes. So there were swing voters who were so turned off by the fact that rather than going through the normal process of how an allegation is supposed to be dealt with in the Senate, that it was held until the last moment, until what looked like just a politically convenient moment, and then rolled out with a PR campaign and in a way that was coordinated with the Democrat senators, unfortunately. We learned that there is a process in place for looking at allegations like this that came about after the Thomas and Hill confirmation debacle, and that they said we want to be able to look at allegations because you can't just dismiss them out of hand. You want to make sure you can investigate, find out what, if anything, happened. But there also should be a way that doesn't drag both the accuser and the nominee into the spotlight and create problems for them all going forward. Reputational issues of bringing someone out to the public and making them a target in that way. So they have a confidential process that the FBI is supposed to run, and Senator Feinstein unfortunately did not follow that process, instead holding on to the letter until the last moment. And so that was something that was raised red flags with a lot of the swing votes within the Senate. And I would hope that maybe a lesson has been learned that in the future, there's a confidential process, folks, and it can be done confidentially. And I think that's what Christine Blasey Ford said she was interested in doing, is having this looked into in a confidential manner. There's also new information that we've learned that makes it sound like perhaps her lawyers didn't have that as their goal. So whether that was her, that certainly was her stated goal. We can't get in her head. We don't know what her real agenda was, but new revelations have shown that her lawyers, even as she was saying she didn't want to testify, were going on TV saying she would testify, and were arranging it so that instead of a private testimony, which she said she preferred, and the Senate Judiciary Committee said they would make available, they wanted to make it a public hearing, and they were pressuring her in that direction. So there's a lot of evidence that they were manipulating the process.
And that's reported in the new She Said book that is out by 2 New York Times reporters as well.
I mentioned a moment ago Judge Carswell from here in Tallahassee back in 1970. After he was rejected, Senator Albert Gore, the father of the vice president, Senator Albert Gore was quoted when asked why. He said that he thought that he'd like to think that many senators in the still of the night thought of the future of the republic and what was best for the country. He was incidentally defeated in the next election, partially because of his vote against a Southerner on the Supreme Court. Do you think, given the current climate, what we've seen with Supreme Court nominees, do you think members can afford to, with the exception perhaps of Joe Manchin, did any of the senators think of the republic as opposed to what is this going to do to me when they voted on Judge Kavanaugh?
Well, first, I love that you mentioned Carswell, because that was, we want to show the history of how this process got here. And a lot of people think back and say, well, it started with Bork, but we talked to people, including Leader McConnell, who said, actually, no, Hemingway and Carswell were where these sort of vicious attacks started. So it was definitely already in the works back then, the attacks on Supreme Court nominees. Again, it's hard to get in the, yeah.
Susan Collins,
for example, right? Yeah, I think of people who are looking at it and saying, what is not just what's going to help me politically, and if you look at right now, it may be hurting her politically. There's definitely a lot of controversy in what was already going to be a tight race. But saw that, she went through, and we described very systematically, maybe Mollie, you want to tell the story of how she was very consistent in looking at Brett Kavanaugh's nomination, the same way she looked at Merrick Garland's nomination, the same way she's addressed every nominee that she has dealt with as a senator.
Right, and Susan Collins is not on the Judiciary Committee, so for her to look exhaustively at Brett Kavanaugh's record required her to bring on like literally a dozen new staff attorneys who could look through the record, who could evaluate every decision he made, speeches, law review articles and whatnot. And she realizes at some point that she knows more about Kavanaugh than most of the people who are discussing him, because she would talk with people who said, well, do you know in that speech he said such, and she'd say, but if you know in footnote 4, he specifically says that he doesn't want it to be interpreted this way. Like, she had a level of knowledge about him that was not matched by many other senators. She took her advice and consent role extremely seriously. And before Kavanaugh was even nominated, she was targeted by outside leftist groups as a person who might not vote for the eventual nominee. And beginning before he's even nominated, she's getting in her district offices in Maine packages of like threatening packages to really encourage her to vote against whoever the nominee is. And her staff are facing unbelievable threats from people, including threats of rape and other forms of violence. She loses one of her young female staffers who just says she can't take it anymore. And even in the midst of all this, even she has people protesting at her house on Capitol Hill. Her own home in Maine ends up being targeted by someone claiming that they've done a biological warfare attack on her. Just unbelievable threats. And through it all, she just decides, I'm not going to be bullied. And so she evaluates the record, and she meets with him for a very long period of time. She talks to him again after the allegation first starts coming out. And she's open-minded to everything. She wants to hear everything. She doesn't just vote for him. She gives a speech on the on the Senate floor, where she explains due process, rule of law, and why it's important to take allegations seriously, how to evaluate them, what different standards of evidence are for different types of things, and how she ends up coming to her decision. And as Carrie noted, this might not work out well for her in her state. She might lose her seat, but in her mind, and she might not too. It actually gained her a lot of support and also gained her a lot of anger. But in her mind, she just couldn't live with herself if she didn't evaluate the evidence and come to a calm, rational decision rather than be bullied by people who wanted her to vote a certain way for political reasons.
There were 3 senators at least that were defeated the Democrats, that were defeated last year, including our own Bill Nelson, Claire McCaskill, Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota. I don't think that the...
Joe Donnelly.
Yes, in Illinois. The Supreme Court did not, I don't think, figure largely in the Nelson defeat. Did it in other states, and should it, do you think? Is this such a huge decision of all the things the Senate considers? Should this be a factor in the minds of voters?
A lot of different ways to answer that. And first off, I'll just note that many of the senators who lost themselves said that their loss was attributable to their votes on Kavanaugh, specifically Claire Manchin, Joe Donnelly. In Heidi Heitkamp's case, I think she was already going to lose, and that sort of informed her vote. So they themselves think that played a big role. And we get into, again, the history of how the Senate becomes so important precisely because they are confirming Supreme Court nominees. Now, whether that's a good thing or not actually relates to the issue of Supreme Court jurisprudence, which I think Carrie should address. But you start seeing outside groups on right and left start paying a lot of attention to Senate races, not because the Senate is passing a lot of legislation, obviously they're not, but because they're playing such a key role in judges. And that judges and justices have become such key players in our republic is not a particularly good thing, but relates to how the court has changed over recent decades.
Yeah, and I would say that the fact that given the role of the court it is now, the fact that voters are aware of the Senate's role in that and are using that to inform their votes, I think that's actually a good thing. There's supposed to be, the Constitution arranges the judicial confirmation process where the Senate nominates, or the President nominates, the Senate confirms. So there is supposed to be this democratic check on the president's nominating power. And the way that that's mediated is through the Senate, the votes for the Senate. So the fact that people are taking that aspect of the Senate, good thing, these are people who are sitting on the bench for life. They're having a generational impact on the court and on the country. However, I think it would be much more healthy for all of us and would have taken down the temperature of the Supreme Court a notch if the court were more restricted to its constitutional role. There's a lot of, when we trace in the book some of the progression of how confirmation processes have gotten so heated over the last decades. And some of the reasons include the fact that the federal government is a lot bigger than it once was, so there's more topics that federal law deals with. It used to be that state courts dealt with a lot more issues, relatively speaking. As federal law grows, the federal Supreme Court gets more important. There are a lot of issues that are becoming nationalized and constitutionalized with the way that the court has made its decisions. So every time the court reaches out to decide the Constitution covers a new topic area, that whole area becomes a political hot potato now for the Supreme Court. And where the Constitution does cover something, obviously that is their role, but I think there's a tendency on the part of many federal judges to say, hey, if there's a problem, there must be a solution that we can find somewhere in the Constitution. That's just simply not the case. The Constitution isn't a one-size-fits-all solution to every human problem. Many of them are supposed to be solved other ways. And also, judges are not the way that we have of amending the Constitution. So if we want to add something new and we think the Constitution should address an issue that it's not talking about simply because it wasn't an issue in 1789, that's not the way to do it. There's a whole amendment process. It is difficult. It is intentionally difficult because we don't want to be flippantly changing our founding documents, but it certainly shouldn't be done by the votes of 5 unelected judges on the Supreme Court. And so every time they do that, and that turns them into what effectively is a super legislature where they're amending either our laws or our Constitution by the vote of judges. And Justice Scalia talked about how if you have judges acting in this way like politicians, then we shouldn't be surprised when their confirmation processes become these political games. And that's unfortunately been ratcheting up progressively over the last several decades, and this last confirmation was certainly no exception.
Although, if there is a moment of hope on it, I think if you looked in the last term of the Supreme Court, they were willing to just say on certain issues, we're not going to, this is not the forum for us to address these issues, which is frustrating people who want them to make those decisions, but probably good for the long-term health of the Republic, again, to lower the temperature. Yeah.
We saw in the last couple of weeks a very interesting and explosive New York Times story. The experience, I don't think for most of this group we need to go through the details. Basically, the Times ran a story about the Kavanaugh Confirmation and left out the fact that this new accuser they had discovered had no recollection personally and had not interviewed with the reporters. They somehow forgot to include that, or an editor took it out of the story. What do you think? First of all, do you think that any high school newspaper could actually make such a mistake? And secondly, do you think it had any effect on the reputation of either the New York Times or the Supreme Court?
Mollie, this is your media criticism.
Right. So that was an interesting what they were going through. And I just want to point out that when Carrie and I wrote our book, we interviewed more than 100 people, some of them for several interviews lasting many, many hours. We really wanted to get the definitive story down about the confirmation battle, but also about anything we could get on Justice Kavanaugh or key players in the story. And we had some really great stories that we couldn't corroborate with second people, and we left them out. And we did that because we felt it was important, particularly the more explosive the allegation was. We had some pretty explosive stuff about accusers, but we felt that it needed to be on the record if we were going to include it in our book. And if people weren't willing to do that, and if we couldn't verify it through other means, we simply decided not to include it. And I think that's the proper way to handle such allegations. These other reporters clearly didn't have much access to a lot of people, and although their whole pitch was that they had gone to school with Justice Kavanaugh or been in similar school environments as him. So they were talking to classmates and whatnot, but they didn't have everything really locked down. It's interesting that after a year of trying to find just anything additional to support or corroborate these other stories, they admit that they were unable to. They brought out solely this other allegation that turned out to be based on someone who did not ever claim she was a victim. And they left out multiple pieces of information that they should have left out, not just that, but other things as well. I'm glad you point out that a high school student, journalism student, wouldn't have done this, because it's not just these reporters, it's also their editors. And it's sort of a journalism-wide problem that we're seeing people find it a little too easy to put forth allegations that can harm people's reputation. Yes, it hurts the New York Times reputation. It also hurts Justice Kavanaugh's reputation. And reputational harm is a real harm. And I think we all, no matter who we're dealing with, no matter which political opponent we want to believe the worst about, we should always be careful to judge facts and be careful about our use of those facts, because it can cause real, actual harm to someone when you make claims about people. And I began by saying we can't claim to know beyond what we know. We did interview quite a few people who knew Justice Kavanaugh from childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, his current life, and they all tell pretty similar stories about what he was like, what his character was like. We've interviewed a lot of ex-girlfriends. The man has a lot of ex-girlfriends. And they all just praised him left and right. And they were quite specific about it, saying if they were in a situation where they needed to change, he turned his back. They all tell stories like this. It didn't match with what the claims were, these unsupported claims from other people. And it is important that not just that you don't run with wild allegations, but when you get a series of people, and they had to have been talking to some of the same people we were, because the people told us, that they also include that information about what his character is like and how it has been determined to be over the course of decades.
If there are questions from the audience, please start lining up, because they asked me to keep it brief, only a few questions. Continuing with the media, do you think that the media, ranging from Rachel Maddow to Brett Baer to whatever, left and right, do they play too great a role in what ideally I would think should be a scholarly, albeit political process? Is there any way that, particularly with lurid accusations like these and the Clarence Thomas accusations, is there any way that you think the media should handle such reputational matters in a major story?
I do not have kind words about, in general, the way our media are approaching most stories. And just to take it completely out of the Kavanaugh scenario, obviously our media are extremely hostile to President Trump. And that's fine, I guess, even though it's not what I would want their role, for them to see their role as. But by the way that they approach him, by treating him as something other than like a president, they end up hurting their own efforts to go against him. They say outlandish things that he can easily point to as fake. And counterintuitive as it might be, the best way to take him on is to just report accurately about what is going on. Not to get emotional, not to get political, not to go full head into activism, but just report the news. It's the best, report the actual facts is, in my view, a much better way to, if you want to oppose him, to oppose him. And we see just this like willful departure from journalism, reporting facts accurately, into advocacy. And I think that's actually very harmful for the Republic. We don't have shared information sources that we can all go to. We can't trust what we're getting in major corporate media. And that's, I believe with Thomas Jefferson, he said that if he had to choose between having a government or having newspapers, he would choose newspapers, because this was the way that the populace kept informed. We don't have really good journalism that's keeping people informed. We have journalism that's just doing advocacy. And advocates are fine, and they're good, but there's a role for advocacy and there's a role for just accurately presenting information. So when it comes to a Supreme Court battle, you can just see it from the very beginning that if it's a nominee from a certain person, they're gonna get trashed, they're gonna dig for dirt, and it's that one-sided nature of that advocacy that also makes, that I think corrodes the process. And also we have a problem with journalists not being that well educated and not seeking to be well educated. They talk about personal stuff from high school because they know that issue well. They don't talk about someone's legal reasoning or opinions because they don't know it, they're not educated, and they don't seek to learn about these things or the actual impact that someone might have on the court. So, sorry for going off on that, but I think we have a really bad situation, and I really hope that we start seeing some outside accountability of some kind for our major media who are not serving the Republic or our civil discourse very well. I just have to say, I love seeing that there are people here. We met people left, right, moderate, everything. It's just great to see that people here are able to communicate with each other in a civil fashion. And that's something that used to be a lot more common, and I think the media could help encourage that more through doing their jobs better.
And just to follow on that, I think it would be ideal to have a media that was more balanced and trying to just stick to the facts. But in the absence of that, one of the things that I think an interesting exchange that we talk about in our book is one that came out between Justice Scalia's son, Chris Scalia, who tweeted out after the Kavanaugh confirmation, can you imagine what this would have looked like without some of the conservative media that now exists, whether it's Fox News or National Review or The Federalist, you cited a bunch of different ones, because the corporate media was really so one-sided. And there was a reply to that tweet from Robert Bork Jr., and he said, yes, I can. And I think that is one big difference between there's a lot of things that we have learned from seeing some of these nominations over history, whether it's the Bork nomination, the Thomas nomination, but one of them was the importance of having alternative means of getting the information out there if you have a media that's not willing to be playing it straight and telling the whole story. And that was something that made the Kavanaugh confirmation possible as a success as opposed to the Bork confirmation.
Are there ways that we could improve the confirmation process? Is anything doable? First of all, would Mitch McConnell or the Democrats give up any of these now? But is there a way that the system could be improved, do you think?
Honestly, it's a little challenging because unilateral disarmament has never been a very effective process, and unless there were a system that you can't say, it used to be much more of this understanding, and some people like Susan Collins and Lindsey Graham used to hold to this idea of basically you're going to just confirm anyone who is qualified, and we're not going to look at their approach, the way they approach the law, and acknowledge that there's some very different things there. That kind of works if everyone's doing it. At this point, virtually no one's doing it, except for maybe Susan Collins.
Did you see Sonia Sotomayor today was out saying something to this effect, like, wouldn't it be nice if our Senate Judiciary Committee evaluated qualifications instead of like these other things? And Justice Ginsburg has talked about how she was virtually unanimously confirmed, even though she had a long history of activism and worked for the ACLU, et cetera. To go back to that corporate understanding, I don't think is possible at this point, because neither side is going to lay down arms, and I think it's unreasonable for anyone to say, oh, well, I'll just vote this way. You know what, no one else is going to do it. On top of which, I actually think it makes sense to have a real evaluation of someone's judicial philosophy. I don't think personal attacks, like we saw here, that I think should always be off the table for everyone, and I would hope that this doesn't ever happen again, although I have to say, given the likely stakes of any next future Supreme Court seats, especially if Trump remains in the White House, I don't see the temperature dropping anytime soon, because it just seems like it's such a hair on fire issue for somebody on the left. But I think looking at and having a vigorous debate about the judicial qualifications would be a better place to be, and confine it to that as opposed to getting personal. The only way I can think of to really take it down a notch goes back to what I was talking about before, which is if the judges actually did confine their work to looking at the text of the law, looking at the text of the Constitution, then we don't have to wonder, well, what does he or she think about abortion? What do they think about gay marriage? What do they think about guns? That shouldn't be our analysis. It should be, what do they think about how do I interpret the law? And then if they're committed to interpreting the law as it's written, then it puts it back in the camp of Congress. And if you don't like the laws, then you can talk to your elected representatives, and they're the ones who write them. They're the ones who can amend them. And then we wouldn't have to have this kind of process for our judges, and I think that would be better for the country, is how the Constitution was designed.
You mentioned how do they feel about abortion, guns, etc. Different issues. Looking back over nominations, and I was here in '70 when Carswell was up. I didn't write a whole lot about it, but there was almost exclusively discussion of him, rather than what he had ruled as a first district and circuit judge on issues. Of course, we didn't have abortion as an issue in 1970. But say with Justice Thomas, I don't recall anybody saying, I like his position on the issues on abortion and guns and such. But I really think he did harass Anita Hill, and vice versa. I've never heard anybody say, I don't believe all that stuff about Anita Hill. However, you know, he's not getting a fair hearing on the issues, his judicial record. Do you ever have you ever heard a conservative who didn't like Thomas or a liberal who liked Kavanaugh, either of you in your research? Or does it always follow, their opinion of his guilt or innocence follows what they think of his?
There are different issues. There are the senators,
Yeah.
and there are other people as well. In Kavanaugh's case, actually, he had broad appeal across the political spectrum, in part because he's frankly a pretty, not moderate, how would you say? He's a consensus builder. When he served in his district court, he was someone who was known for being able to bring different groups together. Susan Collins actually found out that he and Merrick Garland, that was President Obama's nominee, who was never even considered by Mitch McConnell, by the Senate, they agreed on 93% of their cases. So Justice Kavanaugh, if you were going to look at someone who was broadly liked across the spectrum, actually both Merrick Garland and Justice Kavanaugh would be great examples of that, and it turned out not to matter. Now we did, I told the story about Leland Kaiser, and she felt that she's very much someone who believed in following rules, and she didn't like that people were flouting rules to get him. She didn't like him personally, she didn't want him on the court, but she knew he was qualified, and she didn't like the games that were being played. I think that's an example of someone being kind of independent there. But in general, it's hard to fault people to some extent for playing politically about what is clearly a political game, as it has been the case with a lot of these nominations.
But I do think what happens all too often, and this is partly because there's still this tension in a lot of people's minds about what should we be looking at in Supreme Court nominees. As I said, the previous regime was kind of, well, we go on qualifications. And because there are a lot of people who don't want to admit that what they're looking at is actually, I disagree with his judicial philosophy. I don't like the way he interprets the law. They don't want to say that. And so instead they look for some other proxy. Well, it's not that I don't like, I just, his temperament, or it's because he harassed this person, or whatever. They're looking, so they almost latch onto that to excuse the fact that they really are voting against him because of and it's a political disagreement with it in terms of what kind of judges and what kind of interpretive devices they should be using. So I think this is where you get people who really they disagree with Justice Thomas or Justice Kavanaugh on their judicial approach many times, or maybe at least on the results they think will follow from it. Like, oh, I think if he interprets the law this way, he's going to rule on my favorite issue a different way. So then they look for some other thing that they can nitpick on.
I would like to just mention one more thing since we're talking about Carswell, which is one of the things we looked at were the history of Republican nominations to the Supreme Court. And if you are a Republican or you know Republicans, you know that Republican voters have been extremely dissatisfied with what Republican presidents have done when they have a nomination. And you look at the Carswell nomination, that wasn't particularly because Nixon felt that he had good jurisprudence. It's because he thought that if he picked someone from the South, it would help him electorally. And you see these examples throughout Republican presidents where they are picking people for political reasons and it doesn't work out particularly well. Eisenhower and Nixon being great examples of this. We sort of chart how Republican administrations learn from these failures and the significance of their failures, that short-term electoral gains are not sufficient for a loss of a generation on the Supreme Court. And look at how President Trump puts together a list of potential nominees that then become the exact nominees he promises he's only going to pick from this list that he put forth, where he's vetting people. And there are political considerations there. For instance, you'll notice that the first list that comes out doesn't have anyone swampy. It doesn't have Kavanaugh or someone who's from DC or the coasts. The first list is just full of candidates that Republican voters would very much like to see on the court, but from the middle of the country. And then as the list is updated, you see some more fleshing out from different geographical regions. But by putting out the list, it ends up winning him the presidency. 1 out of 4 voters that he gets say they voted for him precisely because of the Supreme Court. So it's this new era of unprecedented transparency that it'll be interesting to see if you see other candidates doing this as well. Just saying, here's the list I'm going to pick from. You can look at it for yourself. And it is very persuasive with Republican voters who, much as they might like President Bush or President Reagan, felt disappointment about some of the picks that they made. And you're starting to see some indication that Democrats are also putting together lists, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out as well.
Right now, there actually seems to be a lot of tension within the Democrats. The activists and the donors really would like to see a list, actually. They want to know, like, who is this going to be? The candidates are running from it as fast as they can. They do not want to commit to a list. So
because there's a lot of vulnerability.
There is, and you've got people out there that someone can start looking into them, doing their opposition research. That was the kind of received wisdom. A lot of Republicans said Trump was crazy to put a list out until it turned out it worked. So it's going to be interesting to watch, especially with so many Democrats in the field. I think maybe if one domino falls, you might see a bunch of lists. It's going to be fun to watch.
Off topic, perhaps even more entertaining than the Kavanaugh hearings, what do you think of impeachment? As longtime Washington observers, what do you think of the climate in Washington now?
I'll give you a legal perspective on the calls for impeachment of Justice Kavanaugh after this New York Times book with its now debunked.
Yes, which impeachment might be?
Yes.
Last week was Kavanaugh's
This is the problem.
impeachment.
Who are we impeaching? Some of it is like, I think, again, it's like it's another use of almost a proxy to get at what you don't want to say, which is, I think in their case, I'm really angry that Trump won in 2016, and therefore we got to find something. And so this Kavanaugh impeachment, I think, is one of the sillier ones, just because, first of all, as a constitutional matter, it's not even, I think the vast majority of constitutional scholars would agree, it's not even possible to impeach someone for something they did before they took office, because they serve during good behavior. That means once you're on the bench, you have to maintain good behavior. What you did 30 years ago as a freshman in college is not actually part of that. So there's really no legal basis whatsoever, even if everything the New York Times reported had been in fact true. You couldn't impeach them. So it looks to me like just another one of these, we're trying to find some way to highlight how frustrated we are about the fact that Trump's in the White House.
Not that I in any way expect any of you to have followed my work, but if you have followed my work in recent years, you would know that I spent a great deal of time questioning the conventional wisdom that Donald Trump was a traitor who had won the election in 2016 by colluding with Russians. Now, that was the conventional wisdom in Washington, D.C., very firmly held to by people who you would be surprised, like way too many people who were too smart to have fell for this. And I didn't buy into it, in part because I actually knew people who had voted for Donald Trump, and they did not seem to be Russian or conspiring with Russians, but having concerns that people in the media were not aware of or not covering accurately. So I spent years looking at that conspiracy theory and evaluating it, debunking it, going up against a lot of people who said that it was definitely true. And then we all know, with the end of what is called the Mueller probe, although we also now know that Robert Mueller was not actually in charge of that probe, that there was not a single American legitimately accused in the legal proceedings of colluding with Russia to steal the 2016 election, much less anyone in the Trump administration. A lot of other stuff that got wrapped up in that theory, but the central animating principle of this, which began during the campaign in 2016, was about Russian collusion. And you might remember that there were people within the government that were talking about insurance policies in the case that Donald Trump was elected and how to deal with that problem of what the voters might choose. And we saw that play out for several years. I have looked at the whistleblower complaint. I have noticed how it's rolling out in the media. I have noticed which reporters are doing it, which people inside are involved, what this whistleblower complaint looks like. And it looks basically just like that dossier, that Russia dossier that was first reported in January of 2017. Allegations, insinuations, I've heard this from someone, and someone told me this, and it's kind of like a map for how to do a special counsel probe or how to do some type of investigation. I am, because it's the same people, rolling out the same operation that affected this country so grievously for 3 years. Sidelined an attorney general, removed a national security advisor, launched a special counsel for years. Because we went through that, and because the same people are doing the same thing, my standard for what they have to demonstrate before I even begin to buy into it is extremely high. And to say that they haven't met it would be a big understatement. It has nothing to do with whether or not Donald Trump will be impeached, by the way. I have long argued that he will be impeached for the crime that he committed, which is winning the 2016 election. A lot of people view that as a crime, and everything you can kind of see for the last couple of years. And I totally get it if people don't like it. It's just sometimes you win elections and sometimes you lose elections. And sometimes you have to deal with the fact that someone you really strongly don't like is president or governor or senator or whatnot. But that the impeachment that might happen seems to be an even thinner read than what we saw with Russia collusion or obstruction. And now it's, he did foreign policy I didn't like. And the other thing that will be interesting is if it is pursued, having done a lot of research on the Russia collusion hoax, a lot of it is centered in Ukraine. Ukraine was a country that has been reported to have actually meddled in the 2016 election on behalf of Hillary Clinton. Really better to say they worked with the Democratic National Committee. So it'll be interesting if we decide to turn our attention to Ukraine and look at what their role was in 2016 meddling, or the fact that the author of the dossier met a lot of his contacts in Ukraine, that Paul Manafort, the Trump campaign manager who was convicted of all these things, was doing his work, he was convicted for work he did in Ukraine, that this is where all of these key players, the people who were leaking in the Obama administration, these were people who met up in Ukraine. So I'm all for turning our attention to Ukraine. I'm not sure it'll go exactly as planned by the people who are running this operation, but I guess we'll find out in the coming weeks and months.
Thank you all.